Bird nerds, I'm sure over the last year or so you've seen lots of coverage about bird flu sweeping through colonies of seabirds and populations of migratory birds and other birds that congregate together. And it's just made you think, oh my God. Well, I invited back Dr Michelle Wille to speak to me about the current state of bird flu in the wild bird populations of the world. Enjoy this colony of gannets. Oh, by the way, there's a whole lot of ways you can support the show now. Just go to thebirdemergency.com/support. Enjoy. Hello everyone, it's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant, I'm a bird nerd, and I'm joined for the second time on the Bird Emergency, Dr Michelle Wille. And Michelle has a number of titles. Her main one is a fellow at the ARC Discovery Early Research Awards. Beg your pardon. You have received an ARC Discovery Early Research Fellowship Award, haven't you? That's how you live. That's what pays your bills at the School of Medical Sciences, University of Sydney. Also, collaborating, doing tests and stuff. This is the one that made me think of Michelle for this topic. World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza, and also an honorary position. You'll have to explain this one at the University of Melbourne, Department of Microbiology and Immunology. So you're a bug, or not bug with legs, but bug and lurgy expert. How does an honorary position work? Are you, like in the business world, we'd have to say you're a consultant. How does it work when you're at the University of Sydney and at the University of Melbourne?
It means that I'm officially employed through the University of Sydney, but because I live in Melbourne and I have a desk in Melbourne, I also have an appointment in Melbourne, but it's honorary, so I'm not officially employed.
No, but they've given you somewhere to hang out and use the phone and the internet, right? Is that how it works? And do you support anyone in any lab work or reviewing anyone else's work?
So I have many colleagues there and we work closely together. So I also do some teaching there.
Great. And where's the bird flu headquarters for Australia?
So I don't think there is one bird flu headquarters for Australia. There are many organisations that are involved in the response. These can include research organisations like universities, where I am, a number of state laboratories, as well as Commonwealth spaces are involved. So yeah, it's a huge collaborative effort.
Yeah, and let's start now, Michelle. How much of a threat is bird flu to the world bird populations generally? And I'll scroll through so I don't get distracted, but I've found a whole heap of headlines for bird flu from around the world and some distressing images.
Yeah, so bird flu is catastrophic, I would say. I think it's really since early 2021, it has just been going through bird populations at a shocking rate. We don't have a good idea of how many wild birds it's killed, but I would argue it's likely in the millions. In many instances, this virus has wiped out 20% of a population, 20% of a species. So it's certainly going to have species level implications for many bird species. And the situation is just generally not great for birds.
Now, you mentioned millions of birds. I've done a couple of interviews talking to people about bird strike, and bird strike is estimated to kill 1 billion birds in the American flyaway alone. So if you put a similar losses on the two other main flyways, you're looking at maybe 3 billion birds just from bird strike. And then if we put avian influenza on top of that, with huge tolls on breeding colonies in pretty much every part of the world. You were telling me that we still haven't got the avian influenza strains that are knocking out colonies of seabirds and other migratory birds all over the world. But is there anywhere else that is untouched at the moment?
Antarctica is... It's only Antarctica and Australia that have not been affected yet.
And can we be confident that it hasn't reached Australian populations, or is it because so much of Australia isn't densely populated and maybe monitored, and so many of the birds that visit our shores are birds that may be mingling with infected birds in other parts of the world at different times of the year, at the North Pacific, the sub-Antarctic, the Western Pacific. We've got shearwaters that go to the California coast, curlews that come from Alaska and Russia.
Yeah, we have actually tried to address this. So myself and a colleague of mine did a lot of surveillance last year during September and December, that period when migratory birds are arriving. And my colleague went all the way up to Broome to go and sample waders. We sampled shearwaters as they were arriving to the colonies here in Victoria. And we also did monitoring of waders in other locations following arrival, just to try to make sure that there was absolutely no evidence of the virus here. And every single sample we tested was negative, which was really encouraging. And our findings have just come out in an academic journal. I think based on what's happening in other countries, if the virus would have arrived, and even if it was in birds that go to remote areas, we would have known about it because of the massive die-offs that this virus is causing. And so it didn't take long for people in South America to realize it had arrived in South America, because it's killing poultry and wild birds at a shocking rate. So I think for now we can be confident it's not currently in Australia, but that doesn't change that it might still. And so our highest risk period of arrival is really between August and November, when most of the migratory birds arrive from their migrations.
One of the things that has concerned me about the discussion that tends to go on about bird flu is only about the economic impact that it might have on the poultry industry. We deal with diseases in poultry industries. There's Newcastle disease and more. So we can deal with that, and poultry aren't roaming around freely within the environment. Do you think we're missing out in the discussion and in the public policy conversations by not talking about wild populations at the forefront of our concern?
So I certainly agree with you on this point. For a great example is that we actually know how many chickens have died or been killed due to this virus. It's about just over 500 million, so that's 500 million birds. We don't even have an idea of the order of magnitude of how many wild birds have died, because no one's bothering to count. So that just demonstrates the priorities. Obviously, most responses are paid for by governments, and losses in poultry costs a lot of money, the governments have to pay out. And so the priority is for these economical activities. We also are seeing really high priority for human health. So there's a lot of movement in the space of protecting humans from potential future infections, but no one really cares about wild birds. So that's certainly true. And so I think we're trying to encourage our colleagues to really pay attention to wild birds. Some nations and some governments are prioritizing that. We've seen some great documentation come out from some countries. The BTO has just provided a huge booklet of how to do surveys and how to respond. So that's really encouraging. But for now, most governments are largely reactive and paying attention to poultry. Now, the thing about poultry is that you'd think biosecurity is really good, but it's actually not that great. And what we're seeing is cases where wild birds are giving it to poultry and poultry are giving it back to wild birds, more so in some countries than others. So what's happening in poultry does affect wild birds, and what's happening in wild birds does affect poultry, and obviously should be considered.
Yeah, this one I'm putting up now, domestic goose, but a pair of mallards, just two mallards rather than a pair of mallards because they're both male, resting on the railroad track near Moses Lake in Grant County, Washington State. Now, these are birds that are just too tired, too fatigued to move any further. The reason I'm bringing up all these headlines is it's everywhere in the world. One of the last 14,000 in Peru. Mongolia was one of the last tabs that I brought up. What's this one? This is something, where's this? This one's about the different types of birds in the Farne Islands. Terns, puffins, gannets and hen harriers. And are there any birds that aren't susceptible? Any sort of bird groups, bird families, Michelle? Or is it everybody?
I don't know if they're not susceptible, but most cases are in birds that are associated with water in some way. and in birds that are either predators or scavengers. So, for example, we're a lot of outbreaks in waterfowl. We're seeing a lot of outbreaks in seabirds. Terns are in there. And then obviously things like hen harriers and bald eagles. There's a great paper recently about bald eagles, because the bald eagles are obviously eating the carcasses of infected birds. We're not seeing a lot of cases in things like passerines, but we do know that passerines that live in chicken barns will sometimes be infected by bird flu, but we don't tend to see a lot of that out in nature. So yeah, mostly in birds that are associated with water and predators.
Do you remember when we had our first chat, Michelle, and I asked you how likely were we to have a bird flu pandemic? And I was relating it in terms of the coronavirus pandemic for Australians. And I think at that time, you seemed to think that it was pretty unlikely that we'd have an avian influenza pandemic. And I reckon on the best available evidence at the time, it was probably a fair opinion to hold. What's changed?
Yeah, so just to clarify first, pandemics relate to humans. So this is not a pandemic. Yeah. This is called a panzootic. It's a different word, and it applies to animals. So just to make that distinction. At the time when we chatted, we were seeing outbreaks mostly in Asia and in Europe, and in some instances in Africa. And the situation had been like that for at least 6 years. Things were just consistently the same, but we've certainly seen a genetic change in the virus, and some recent studies have come out that have shown that the virus, rather than being really well adapted to chickens, which has been the case since 1996, the virus is now better adapted to wild birds like waterfowl. And we suspect that may be one of the reasons why we're seeing such an explosion of outbreaks, in that if the virus is better adapted to wild birds have the capacity to spread it around and to introduce it in new places, which it has never been before. And so the situation changed pretty quickly.
While I've been perusing all of these articles, and they're in so many different publications, many of these stories, and they're really from 2021 through to current day, they're mentioning that the spread seems to be, or may be, facilitated by the rise in ocean temperatures and in global temperatures generally. Do you have a view on that?
So I think I've seen speculation around that, but I've not really seen a lot of evidence for that. I think I'm still going to stand in the camp that there's been a genetic change, and it's shown, it's clear in experimental infections. But we do know that climate certainly influences outbreaks of avian influenza. So it's been known for many years that when the 0-degree isotherm hits Europe, that's when bird flu outbreaks start in Europe, because that's correlated with when birds arrive. We know that in Australia, the first year of heavy rain after a number of years of drought, that's when we see outbreaks in poultry in Australia. So there certainly is a climate, but I think exactly what that link is yet to be ascertained. Yeah.
Some of the speculation that I've been seeing too in these newspaper headlines mostly and magazine articles have been talking about that perhaps there are different strains. There have been ancient strains of avian influenza that are resurfacing due to the thawing of the tundra. Now, is there any evidence, to your knowledge, for that to be a more than just wild speculation?
So I think that most of the viruses that they have found, these ancient viruses that are coming out of the tundra, most of those viruses are viruses of amoebas. I don't think there is any evidence for ancient influenza strains coming out of the permafrost, and if there is, that's a bit of a leap of trying to connect two things that I think are quite unrelated. There are certainly many strains of influenza that co-circulate, and there are ancient human strains that are found in pigs, but I think the permafrost thing is a bit of a leap.
So the big question that I think everyone wants to talk about is how much of it is the current circulation and the number of birds affected with avian influenza a real concern to the viability of certain populations of certain species? Should we be that worried about it?
Yeah, I think pelicans are taking a huge hit. The outbreak in Greece, I think, wiped out 20% of the pelicans in Greece. That's not a small number. The number of pelicans that we're seeing reported from South America, the numbers are really staggering. Outbreaks in barnacle geese that happened a few years ago, that was 20% of the Svalbard breeding population of barnacle geese died within the span of a few weeks. And because no one's counting, I think that we won't really appreciate the scale of the outbreaks for a few years. But yeah, I think we should be worried. We should really be worried about small populations of birds, colony breeders, because the outbreaks are not going to stop anytime soon. I think it will continue for some time.
And are there many different strains? Like, I've been your posts on Twitter that have been detailing some of the strains. Now, it's all a bit above me. I'm just some yobbo. But what are there more lethal strains that are expanding their range? Is that the right terminology when we're talking about these?
Sure. So what we're seeing now is largely due to one strain, which is the most lethal strain. And it has a really long and complicated name, which is very awful, called high pathogenicity avian influenza H5N1 lineage 2.3.4.4b. Okay, it's a nonsense name. But there are many strains of influenza, and most of them are called low pathogenic avian influenza because they don't cause any disease. They're normally found in wild birds. They're in Australian wild birds.
Yeah, I think that's where our conversation was pretty much last time, wasn't it? That we were talking about that there were two main strains. One was highly lethal, and that wasn't in Australia, but we had a non-lethal one that circulates in Australia and indeed through most of the birds of the world, and that was just in balance. I think that's about the gist of what we were getting to last time.
Absolutely. And so these high pathogenicity strains are highly linked to poultry. So what happens is that these viruses from wild birds, which don't cause disease, sometimes get into poultry production units. And inside these poultry production units, you can just imagine that there's 500,000 chickens. They're all genetically the same. They don't have antibodies. So there's no selection pressure. There's no evolutionary pressure. So the viruses evolve really rapidly in these poultry production units, and they become virulent. So they become highly pathogenic. But they are adapted to chickens. And usually we're able to control these outbreaks. So we come in and do depopulation and stamping out, and that's the end of it. With the exception of this high pathogen H5N1, which has been circulating in some form since 1996 in chickens. Yeah.
Most of the cases in all of those that I went through before were wild birds that were non-passerines being affected. And we were seeing geese, ducks, puffins, grebes, pelicans, as you mentioned. I saw some skewers, lots of gulls and terns. Are non-passerines more susceptible to avian flu than passerines?
I think that's partially true, but the other really important thing is the link to water, because I think water facilitates spread really rapidly. Poultry, gallinaceous birds, so chickens and turkeys are highly susceptible, and then all these other bird groups that are associated with water, and they're obviously non-passerines. And then the only passerines that are involved are things like crows, because they're feeding on the carcasses of infected birds, so they're scavengers.
Other raptors at risk, and you mentioned bald eagles, and they hunt around water generally, and so many of the other birds that we've mentioned are also breeding in colonies, so proximity is probably a factor as well. But I don't want to make this all about Australia, but we're lucky in that Australia and Antarctica are two continents where the virulent strains are not, and is that the right word? The virulent? Virulence about the nature of the spread, or is virulence about the severity once you were infected?
Yeah, it's about how lethal the viruses are.
Okay, and I'm really concerned from an Australian point of view that migratory birds and seabirds seem to be the ones that are being affected in great numbers. Is it likely that we're going to be able to keep it out of Australia and indeed Antarctica and subantarctic islands? Because some of those headlines and pictures from earlier on showed some penguins. So
penguins in southern Africa have been hammered for 3 or 4 years. It's highly concerning. Yeah, penguins are highly susceptible. So I think the thing is that it's unlikely that human intervention is going to keep it out. I don't think there is a lot we can do. We can't stop birds from migrating. That's a thing that birds do, nor should we stop them from migrating either. But I think
that's a big net. But
yeah.
Maybe there could be some team up with Elon and Jeff Bezos could actually come up with some satellites that would hang this massive bird non-lethal net.
You're not condoning it. Yeah, I think the thing for us to do in Australia and Antarctica is be prepared so that we are not catching up from behind. Last year, myself and some colleagues drafted a whole set of recommendations for what to do if it's in Antarctica and how a field team should respond. And we're doing similar exercises here in Australia. We're definitely trying to pinpoint if the virus arrives, where it will arrive, how it will arrive. That can be hopefully integrated into sort of larger responses around biosecurity and things like that.
Let's explore the responses a bit more in a minute, but I've got questions that I reckon people would want clarified. Is there a vaccination that could be applied in any way? And is there any way to control or manage, say, populations maybe in collections around water features and things like that, where people have collections of ornamental waterfowl, peafowl, things like that? Is there a preventative measure that people can take?
Vaccines are very contentious and are the subject of a lot of discussion at the moment. There are a number of vaccines on the market for poultry against avian influenza, but very few countries are using the vaccines, and this may be due to trade embargoes if they use vaccines. Other countries are concerned that the vaccines are not good enough, or some countries are concerned that it will create more challenges.
Superbugs.
Yeah. So the discussion that's happening is, do we vaccinate and potential other problems, but if we vaccinate we can decrease the amount of virus that are in poultry, or do we not do it and rely on traditional measures such as biosecurity and stamping out? So I think that the answer hasn't been solved yet. Australia does not allow for vaccination of birds for avian influenza at all, neither Canada or the USA. The EU has just changed its rules 1.5 weeks ago that allows for vaccinations, but only in certain circumstances and if the countries do a number of things to follow up. So they need to make sure the vaccines are actually working properly. And so the idea is that because we're seeing these viruses go into poultry production, amplified in poultry production, and then from there going back to wild birds, if you can decrease the amount of virus that's in chickens, we might be able to limit the number of instances of spread into wild birds, which will hopefully decrease the outbreaks in wild birds. That's the idea. And so if you're in a country that allows vaccination and you have ornamental birds, you may be able to access those vaccines for ornamental birds. But currently in Australia, you cannot.
So that makes me wonder about management of insurance populations of the endangered birds. It would seem to me, are the vaccines effective? And I'm thinking, if you've got an insurance population of birds, there was the research popped out, I think, this week, that orange-bellied parrots look like we can maintain the population, or not we, but that the population can be maintained, as long as it is supplemented by releases into the wild from captive bred annually. And that looks, and assuming that there's going to be habitat left for them. Does that mean at the moment, if avian flu was detected in Australia, does that mean you cannot vaccinate an insurance population against it? So that's an issue that really, is that being talked about by conservation managers and people like yourself? And is there,
I think that those decisions are up to policymakers. I'm just a researcher. I can tell you about what's going on, but decisions like vaccination and those kinds of are up to policymakers.
But they've got to get information from people like yourself.
They're certainly participating in the international discussions that are occurring now around vaccination. I don't think that they don't know what's going on. I think that they are just weighing the evidence the same as everybody else on how to proceed.
And Is a vaccination for, let's say, poultry, does it have to be administered as an injection or can it be dosed into the water?
I actually have absolutely no idea.
There we go.
I think there is advances in vaccination technology to administer it as a mist. I know that exists. I don't know about for bird flu, but I do know that it exists. But there are risks with that, right? So the big risk is that you don't get an appropriate dose into all the birds. And so that may create some problems if we're talking about poultry, the scale of poultry. But there are a lot of people working on that, so I'm sure there's some cool solutions coming forward.
Do you think, is it possible to actually manage to exclude bird flu? And you mentioned biosecurity. I don't think I've ever been to a large chook shed, and I've been to lots of them, chicken production facilities, where I haven't seen sparrows popping in and out and on the fringes. And the next topic is this strain of bird flu has been found to move to mammals, hasn't it?
Yes. So the same way that raptors get it from eating infected carcasses, we find that many mammals are getting it from eating infected carcasses.
Now, does that include rats and mice that might have a nibble on something?
So I read a paper about the first detection in rats, but the methods that they use don't tell us whether or not the rats were actually infected or whether they just detected the infected birds that they may have eaten. So I think the jury is still out on rats and mice.
Yeah, I couldn't even find any consistent literature from the past year about some of the other mammals that have been mentioned, like pig.
Mammal cases are being collated. So if you go to the World Organization for Animal Health webpage, to the influenza site, you can get a collated list of all the mammals that have been infected. They have similar lists collated by the Americans on their website called APHIS and the Europeans. All the mammalian detections are definitely being reported.
So there's a lot of reporting about minks and closely related animals. Let's war game the strategy in Australia. Are there any cases of cattle and sheep being infected or carriers, vectors?
No, not that we know of. But again, they're unlikely to be infected because they're not going to eat dead birds.
Okay, so foxes might be and feral cats might be possible. So I didn't see a lot about cats being confirmed as being...
Yes, there are many felids.
Yeah.
Lynx and bobcats and cougars have all popped up. The other thing that popped up was coyotes. So I wonder about dingoes.
Yeah.
And Australia, of course, has ferrets that are feral here and a lot of other feral mammals that may be exposed as well.
Are there many occurrences in the Pacific region, South Pacific, Southwest Pacific? I'm wondering particularly when you mentioned ferrets and then stoats and minks. New Zealand has got such a huge feral population of those, and New Zealand, similarly to Australia, has so many unique birds that aren't found anywhere else. I guess the whole world is in that situation, really, with bird flu. But are there occurrences in New Zealand and maybe Port Vila, Vanuatu, where Kevin is at the moment? Fiji?
Yeah, the virus is not currently in New Zealand and it hasn't been reported in any of the Pacific Islands yet. I don't think that means it won't be. It just isn't here yet.
So if you're somebody in Australia who has birds, domestic birds, can you preemptive precautions, or should you just wait until that first news report that it's here?
Yeah, again, this is a tricky one because this is a policy decision. What I'm suggesting is just
it's opinion.
Personal opinion.
Yeah.
But I think that for now, the virus is not here, so I think things are all right. Between September and December, it's really important to be. If you have poultry, I think trying to move them indoors is important, and preventing any contact between your poultry and wild birds is really important. If there is an outbreak in Australia, I wouldn't be surprised if housing orders were not instituted, which would require the movement of poultry inside to limit transmission. But what we really want to do, and what's really important, is that you sever the link between wild birds and backyard birds.
So that raises questions, doesn't it, for free range, for organic poultry products, and indeed for anyone who has backyard chooks.
In 2020, we had a big outbreak of bird flu in Victoria. It was due to a domestic strain that had evolved. It was not due to an international strain. But essentially, what the Victorian government did was institute a housing order. They forced all poultry indoors. And it worked very well to control the spread of the outbreaks. They managed to get it under control in a matter of weeks, which is really incredible given this happened in lockdown number 2 and no one from Melbourne could go and help. So it certainly does complicate things, but I would speculate that this is what will happen. And it makes things complicated for free range and backyard, but it's better to move them indoor than have to kill your entire flock because there's bird flu.
For those regions of the world that have been infected with or have seen infections in their wild bird populations, have they been effective, do you know, in controlling the outbreaks in poultry for production? And I saw one of those examples in all those headlines was pigeons being bred in a large production facility in Spain. So there's far more than just chickens that are used. The basic control method is slaughtering everything, isn't it, when there's an outbreak? And that's basically the only control method. Yep. Clear, uninfected populations can be housed indoors and isolated. Have any countries or regions that you know of that have had these latest strains cross into their production poultry, have they been able to clear it up, or are they just continually managing it as best they can rather than eradicating it?
My impression is that it's management as best they can to decrease or to limit the number of poultry houses that it gets into. Since 2020, I don't think anyone has managed to eradicate it entirely from poultry. But what we see in some instances is links between poultry to poultry, and sometimes they can sever that. And then what may happen is due to poor biosecurity is it comes back into poultry from wild birds again. Obviously, the sparrows that live in there. Many poultry barns are in these wonderful properties that geese like to sit and stop over at. And so it's a huge challenge, and it's mostly reactive. Many countries, I understand, are just trying to keep.
We saw in those photos too the humans that were either attending to sick birds or cleaning up carcasses were in full hazmat gear. So we don't have any cases of transmission from wild birds or dead birds to humans. It's possible, isn't it? It may not be likely, but it's possible, isn't it?
There certainly are human cases. China has had 60 human cases in the last 2 years alone.
And that's transmission from birds, no intermediary mammal?
No, that's from birds.
Okay.
And so almost all the human cases, or all the human cases globally, are in people that have been exposed to sick or dead birds. So, for example, there was a case in the media very recently about human cases in Cambodia, and it was a small whole family that had some poultry, and the birds had died from bird flu, and they got it from bird flu. There was recently a case in Ecuador of a child, the same thing, the birds on their property were all dead. There's been instances where poultry workers have been exposed, so a number of cases in Russia some years ago where poultry workers tested positive for the virus being exposed occupationally. So overall, the risk to humans currently in this moment is low, but if you are occupationally exposed to birds, the risk is a little bit higher. So wearing PPE is very important.
And the last question I have, I think, Michelle, before we can open it up to questions if anyone's got some. If you had chickens that were infected and you put it and ate that meat, is that a way that you are going to increase your chance of getting sick rather than having your pet chicken hang out with you and the kids running around in the chook house?
I would advise that if you have sick chickens, you notify the state government immediately and have them come and dispose of the carcasses. Please do not eat sick chickens, please don't do that.
And of course, Michelle, I said that was going to be the last question. I thought I haven't asked the obvious one. What are the symptoms to look out for if you have a collection of aviary birds, or like you have a collection of peacocks and ducks on your ornamental lake, or you have chickens in your backyard? What should you look out for? What are the early signs that there may be a bird flu infection in your birds?
Or if you're a bird watcher out there, the virus seems to be highly neurotropic. A lot of birds have neurological, there's a lot of sickness behavior as well. If you keep birds, you can see if when they're perky and doing their thing, or when they look quite slow to respond and sluggish, things like that. If you're out birding and you see a bunch of dead birds, that's also a really clear warning sign. I think if you're concerned, please call somebody. Every state has a hotline that you can call. Otherwise, there is an emergency animal disease hotline that's national. It's a 1-800 number. I think if you Google it, it should come up pretty quickly. Otherwise, the Wildlife Health Australia has their phone number on their front page. So if you're concerned, please call somebody and they will guide you through what to do. And it's really important that you notify if you see anything suspicious.
And if you're not in Australia, I would imagine nearly every jurisdiction would have either a Department of Agriculture, of Environment or Conservation or something named like that, and they would be the first places you would go, or ring your local vet and tell them, and they will be able to tell you how or where to make the report, I would think. Michelle, who would they contact in Canada?
Probably, if it's wild birds, I would probably contact the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. They are the ones that manage a lot of the avian influenza surveillance in wild birds. Otherwise, each province will have an agricultural unit that you could probably call and they would come and respond. And this is true, as you said, for pretty much every country. I don't think it would be too hard to find the phone number that you need to call given the current situation. I'm sure that would come up really quick.
Yeah, agriculture would be the first department I would look for because there's an economic imperative for every country that has poultry and an industry around it. So that would be the first place to go. If you're totally stuck or confused, veterinary schools or your local vet, someone will take your information and help you pass it on, because I don't think anyone's messing around. No one's playing with avian flu. Let's open up for the last couple of minutes where we've got you for questions. And thanks, Miles, Facebook love. That was very nice. Kevin, if you're still here, you've probably got a question. Let me tell you, Michelle, Kevin is one half of the Bird Explorers. Kevin's aim is to photograph every bird in the world and every land mammal, I think. And I think he's even moved into fish. So
amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. So let's just see. Michelle, tell us while we're waiting for people to pop a question in, if they do, what's going on in your career? What's your day-to-day kind of work involve?
I mean, it involves writing a lot of reports about avian influenza, but generally I have a really pretty fun job, which is really dynamic. And so I do research on bird viruses. Avian influenza prior to this year was just one component of that. And so my day-to-day varies a lot. Some days I get to go out to the field and sample birds, which are honestly my favorite days. Other days I'm in the laboratory running the tests. So the same way that we all went to go get COVID tests, I do influenza tests or tests for other viruses. And then I also spend a lot of time on my computer doing computational biology.
Valor, Grand Theft Auto.
And I do a lot of writing, obviously, as a researcher. We do a lot of testing. Generally, or prior to this year, it was a combination of those things.
Now, that gives me the opportunity, when you said you're sometimes out in the field sampling birds. Michelle, what's your Twitter handle?
I have the best Twitter handle.
No, you have the second best Twitter handle.
No, I have the best one. My Twitter handle is DuckSwabber, and that's because when I started my Twitter account, I was working a lot on birds, on ducks at the time. And it's very memorable. People don't tend to forget it, unlike my name and the complicated spelling of my surname. So if you put DuckSwabber in, you'll find me. And I'm doing a lot of tweeting at the moment on avian influenza, so if you're interested in that, there's a lot of information.
And of course, we love the imagery that comes to mind when you say duck swabber. I'm thinking the large cotton bud and a duck's bum. But really, it's probably the other end you're swabbing as well, isn't it?
Both ends, absolutely. Yeah.
That's right.
And it's a very small, not cotton anymore, rayon tip or nylon tip, yes.
And of course, we have the eternal battle of the best Twitter handle ever. I'm very happy to give you number 2. But I still give Steph Burrell number 1 for petrol station.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a beauty. We haven't had any questions, so you know what that means, Michelle.
I'm off the hook.
No, it means I did an excellent job. That's what it means.
Great job. Yeah, I think we covered everything, so that was really
It means I've asked all the questions that come to mind. It's really quite distressing, I think, for people who think of birds the same way I do, and I'm sure you do, Michelle, is that every day we're reducing the available habitat by thousands of hectares for wild birds. We're reducing the amount of available water in the far reaches of all of the river catchments, river systems, and now we've got this potential zoonosis emergency that might hit us as well. It's very depressing seeing those shots of all the seabird rookeries in the North Atlantic around Scotland, and then the migrating waterfowl, North America and North Asia. It's heartbreaking seeing the losses. Yeah. Do you think this is a cycle that we're going to be locked into now I think we're locked into global temperature cycling? Do you think we're just going to have to get very used to managing outbreaks of avian influenza?
Yeah, look, I don't think this zoonotic is going to stop anytime soon. I expect at least one more full wave. Yeah, I think we need to think of intervention strategies because what we're doing is really not working, and it's definitely our fault that we are where we are today. But in terms of animal emergencies in general, avian influenza is not the only animal emergency that is occurring in the world. A lot of countries are responding to African swine fever, which affects pigs and boars. And so, yeah, I think that with the way we've set up agriculture and that we have enormous numbers of farmed animals and very small numbers of wildlife, and farming keeps encroaching on that, we're going to continue to have animal emergencies of some kind.
We've only got a minute or so left, so I'll ask you to give us a brief rundown. Apart from swine flu, what are the other potentially catastrophic diseases circulating in the animal world that we should be on the lookout for?
African swine fever is a good one. So it's not flu.
Sorry,
virus. And so many of my colleagues are just as occupied by that. As far as I know, it's not in Australia yet, but there certainly is concerns. There's concerns about rapid expansion of things like lumpy skin disease. I've seen more notifications again about foot and mouth, so that continues to be a problem. I'm sure I'm forgetting other. Japanese encephalitis was an interesting one that came to Australia recently. Yeah, there is lots, but that's what I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah. So do we need to revisit the way we use antibiotics in animal husbandry? Is resistance to antibiotics becoming a thing as well?
Well, that's a whole nother
a whole other episode. I was hoping you were saying, yes, be judicious in your use.
No, you should, absolutely. I think that antibiotic use as a growth promoter is highly irresponsible. But, that is a 2-hour discussion by itself.
Yeah. Maybe, Michelle, every now and then we might check in on bird diseases. If avian influenza is still circulating or becomes a more regional Australasian issue, maybe we'll check in again. Be nice to get Professor David back on as well and talk about that little suite of weird bird diseases that have popped up. Yeah, Michelle, thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you could fit in the time. Stormy's given us some love there, H2 Rider. Yeah, I thought it was an important subject, and I'm really glad that you're pumping out so much information for the academic community, for people who actually understand this stuff better than me to get a hold of easily, because you've been really prolific lately, and that's one of the services of Bird Twitter, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've also been writing articles for popular science communication. So we had one out in The Conversation 1.5 weeks ago. We've got a piece coming out in Pursuit, which is the University of Melbourne popular science magazine, coming out on Monday. And so continue to try to explain things as much as we can.
Okay, so that'll be generally available to people who log on to University of Melbourne and search The Pursuit. Should be able to find that next week.
Yeah, and I'll put it on my Twitter on Monday as well.
Terrific. Then I'll link it as well when I remember. Can you tag me on Twitter and make sure I do remember?
If I remember between now and then.
Yeah. When you're authoring your tweet this afternoon and putting it in drafts. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michelle. This is the Bird Emergency Special Edition, Special Bird Flu Edition. See you later.